Good afternoon, everybody. Got a few more people. Awesome. So I'll continue admitting people in as they come through. This is very much a free-flowing, informal session to answer your questions about housing. Again, I'm Tanya Yanchison. I work with our marketing support within housing, as well as with our Dean of Students Office and Basic Needs. What kind of housing questions can we answer for you today? Oscar, go right ahead.
Yes. Will the dorms be will the dorms be going back to the dorms? Will it be mostly back to normal, or do we still have to follow some?
Yeah, great question. For all of housing, we expect to have some forms of contingency around safety and just any kind of preventative measures that are needed related to the pandemic. Most of this, though, is all going to come down from our local and state guidelines as we get closer to August. We do know in terms of occupancy that we're going to be expecting around 1,300 students, which is very, very different than our 200 students that we had this year. And it's much closer to when we were at our standard occupancy of 1,500 to 1,600 students, which was closer to our occupancy in 2019. So 2020, we definitely had a lower occupancy year to really address the height of the pandemic, but now transitioning back into larger occupancy. We will have doubles. We'll also have some single accommodations, but we'll definitely have a lot of double options. And then now that the CSU has announced that vaccinations will be required by all students, staff, and faculty, unless they have a medical or religious requirement that would result in them not being able to get the vaccine, then those would go through a separate process. But we are going to be under a requirement for the COVID vaccine. And then Brandy, I see your question come in for the virtual tour 50% occupancy. So in terms of housing, our 50% occupancy, that wouldn't necessarily apply to us. So that sounds like something maybe in regards to our classes. I do know for our classroom preparation, we are preparing for not only the 6 feet physical distancing, but also the 3 feet as the CDC currently submitted those guidelines out. And then we're also preparing for if by August we have a no feet requirement, we're preparing for that as well. So we basically have 3 plans set in motion depending on where the pandemic goes. Because as we know, we're hearing a lot of information from the CSU system as well as through local, state, and federal guidelines related to the pandemic. But we also know that there's going to be some kind of wait and see to see how the vaccination goes into full effect within the community. So that's why we're preparing for several different models, as well as in case we were to progress into another situation similar that we saw in 2020, we want to be able to quickly adapt the college experience as needed if we do find that health becomes more of a concern again in terms of the pandemic or variant strains, things like that. So I want to just double check. So we talked about the requirements of the COVID vaccine. So just again, we did hear today, the CSU did announce we will be requiring the COVID vaccination for all students, staff, and faculty, except for honoring exceptions around medical or religious needs. And then Ariana, I see your direct message. Let me know if it's something you want me to announce publicly, because I could definitely do that, or I can come back to you. That way I could type directly as a response.
I am perfectly fine with it being said.
Okay.
Right here.
Perfect. So Ariana asked a question about applying to be an RA and told you would hear back around May. And so that's a great question. So Ariana, you're a current student, correct? Or are you an incoming transfer? Okay, awesome. So for our RA process, I do know right now, the thing about the RA process is it's contingent on occupancy because we can't hire RAs without knowing how many residents we'll have. So that's why we have a conditional offers that will most likely go out in May. And then official offers are always contingent on your GPA, because in order to be an RA, you do need to have a minimum requirement of a 2.5 semester and cumulative GPA. I don't know the exact date, but I would imagine it's going to be the latter part of May versus the earlier part of May. I can definitely provide that feedback to our residential education staff to see if they're able to provide any date or deadline of communication. I do, though, know that they are very fluid at the moment in terms of us getting a lot of new information throughout the month of April. So we've been kind of waiting to make decisions in terms of hiring, because we want to see, are we going to be closer to 1,000 students, or are we going to be closer to that 1,300 mark? We're not sure, because obviously last year was very unusual for how we typically navigate our housing occupancy. So it is a little bit of a wait and see. I know that's not the best answer I could give you right now, but they will be getting back to you for sure. And then for your housing situation, one thing that and if they haven't communicated this already, I would recommend reaching out to RA recruitment at csuci.edu, because usually for our housing students, we let them know if you were applying to be an RA, and you need housing, you want to live on campus, but you're waiting for that contingency, you're welcome to wait till closer to your deadline, which would be May 21st for our returning students. But if you don't want to wait, you can always apply for housing and then cancel at a later date if you find out you were accepted to be an RA, but you wouldn't be refunded the $50 non-refundable $50 or the $50 application fee, which is non-refundable. So that's the only, in a sense, risk you'd be taking, in a sense that would have a financial loss if you were offered the housing position. But you're welcome to also wait to see if they provide that notification prior to the 21st, because then you could wait to apply by then. All right, so going back through.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, Brant. So they said that they don't anticipate a shortage of housing. So in terms of housing, how we're expecting, we typically always operate on making sure that we provide the housing to all the students that need it. So typically we do not find ourselves in a situation where we are not able to provide housing to everyone that's interested. If for some reason we happen to have over 1,300 students interested in living on campus, then at that point we would go back and revisit our priority list. So when you look at our priority list, that's where we're talking about meeting the priority deadline. So for returning students, it's May 21st. For our new incoming freshman students, transfer students, or people that have never lived in housing before, it's June 14th. So as long as you meet those dates, then you're pretty good with housing. That's our priority date, because we do have many people that apply after that are more of, that's where it's a little bit more of a risk, because we guarantee housing for those people that met that priority deadline, which we've always been able to do in past years. If we ever found ourselves in a situation where we weren't able to do that, we would obviously revisit and revise and work with those people that applied, but I don't foresee that happening.
Okay.
Why we have the deadlines earlier, because people tend to sometimes wait and kind of take that risk of availability and apply later. So we do have two different waves of individuals that apply, but that's why we set that priority deadline earlier, because then it guarantees you have housing. And then we also, of course, factor in needs of our PATH students. We do work with our Disability Accommodation Student Services Office. So if students have accommodation needs, there are different kind of priority levels that we work very closely with specific students. So if you do have a specific situation or have your student fall under a specific population, it might mean that there might be a little bit more hands-on outreach to get their accommodation secured in housing.
Okay. Thanks so much. Just real quick, I wanted to be sure I gave the people props. The virtual orientation people were really cool, and they did say, you know, they rarely have any issues. You guys are great to work with. And so, but I was just worried because, you know, with the COVID pandemic, and they did mention that 50%. And so it sounds like there's a couple different plans depending on, okay, cool.
Definitely. Yeah, we are operating We have several models because we wanted to make sure that we went into this year preparing for anything and everything, whether we go back to how we were in March of 2020 when we first got the news through CSUs and really institutions all over and local businesses to alter our occupancy model and how we needed to progress through that. So we're trying to set forth all these different plans just in case. That way, say we get into a situation where we do have to go to physical distancing, or we do have to incorporate PPE because we have a new strain, or we do have to switch classes from on campus to virtual. We're setting up all those plans just in case, but we are going in operating, expecting that it's going to be a much more casual environment around pandemic precautions and COVID precautions based on where we're seeing with herd immunity and vaccinations. But yes, I do know they're providing a little bit more of a strict process in the classrooms, just because it's a little bit different than you being assigned to your bedroom. But we are still reviewing our guest policy. So that is something that still hasn't been decided in terms of how many guests students can have while they live on campus, if they can have guests, because currently this last year we didn't permit guests. So we're looking at changing that going into next year, but there might be some regulations in terms of if you have off-campus guests visiting you, they may have to require vaccination. Not all of that has been determined yet. I'm just saying that as a possibility, but those are where you might see some of the carryover precautions from the pandemic as we wrap it up from a societal, national, and really global level to maintain our cases. But thank you, that's a good question. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and switch over, Maggie. I'm gonna pause to get to your question just in a second because I saw Nellie's hand up for a while. So I'll bounce back to yours, Maggie. But Nellie, if you wanted to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So I'm going to be a sophomore this next coming year, and I didn't live on campus in the fall and the spring. So when would be my application deadline since I haven't lived?
June 14th.
Okay.
You've never lived in housing and really in a sense been in our system, then your application deadline would be June 14th.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And then just to clarify too, the other priority deadline is May 21st. And that is for all students that have lived in housing before and then are returning to live in housing again. But if you've never lived in housing, you're considered a new student to housing. So Maggie, you say you have a friend that's a sophomore, but you're a junior, plan on living in Anacapa, and you want to live with your friend. Is there any way to be able to live in Anacapa even though she's only a sophomore? So typically our sophomore housing is Santa Cruz. It does also depend though, Maggie, what amounts of units your friend has, because if they are a sophomore, but they have at least, and I'd have to go back, because you need at least, I believe it's 45 units to enter Anacapa. So if they took more than 15 units each going into their freshman year, or if they have like AP classes that have unit credits, there could be a possibility that they could go to Anacapa, but it is a unit level that manages that process. So I would say it's likely that you may not be placed in Anacapa, you might be placed in Santa Cruz if you want to live together. I would also talk it over with your friend and determine what is your priority. So is your priority to live together, or is it to live in the buildings that you want? Because you can go into your application and say, I want to live with this person, and I also want to live in this village. And then you then say which one of those two, village or person, or village or roommate, is the priority of the two. And then if you say, well, my village preference is priority, then, and then if she says my roommate preference is priority, then, or if they say roommate preference is priority, then at that point it would automatically still put you in Anacapa. And it could take her over depending on what her ultimate unit level is, but then it really depends. I want to clarify that it's not likely you would be able to be in the same village, but you can associate your preference when you apply through the student housing application as to which you would prefer. That way, if you really want to make sure you still live in Anacapa, but you want to take a shot to see if you'll be able to live with your requested roommate, you would want to establish your ultimate preference as your building preference versus roommate preference. But if you really want to live together and that's your priority, then you'll want to set your roommate preference, but it might mean that you would be in the village assignment that would default to her or default to your requested roommate.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, so after Maggie, we have Garrett. So if school ends up being remote, will housing be refunded at 100%? So that is a good question. I'd have to go back to so in our license agreement, it does address, and that is posted on our housing website, and it does talk about cancellation. Typically though, since we've now experienced the pandemic, we wouldn't go through any additional exceptions. We've written out all of our documents to be able to sustain whatever environment we go through, which is—
No, I think you're misunderstanding the question. The question is, if my son's going to school there, right? And he's going to class every day, and the class is actually happening there, and we're paying for housing on campus there, and all of a sudden in-person classes stop. I have no desire to pay for housing when he's being remote anyways.
Right. And yes, I do understand your question correctly. And so basically the answer would be housing would only be refunded. It would never be refunded 100% because we would fall back to our cancellation policy. So the way our cancellation policy reads, because the way our perception is, that might be an option for you to not want your student to live on campus anymore, but there will be other students that still want to remain on campus, even if we switch back from an in-person to a virtual environment. Now, we completely understand why some people would want to go ahead and opt out, do their virtual environment from home or wherever is most convenient and most cost-effective for them, and not live on campus, but then they would have to file the cancellation process. So if that happened, say mid-year, the license agreement is an academic year license agreement that covers both fall and spring. And so if something were to happen, say in January, the student, if they didn't want to live there in spring, would need to submit a cancellation request. There is a $200 cancellation fee, and depending on when they chose to cancel, there may be some form of payment responsibility for that semester, but depending on the cancellation requirement, it's likely that that would be something you'd work through on a case-by-case basis. But in terms of full refund, once you live in housing, you've already kind of started that. Whatever your cost is, every day is in a sense incrementally deducted if there were ever to be some kind of return of funds based on a cancellation, if that makes sense. So it would never be the full amount. The only time you'd ever get the full amount is if you had paid in full and then canceled your application and your license agreement prior to there being—
Understand. I'm not going to get back something I didn't pay, right?
Right.
I understand that. I think the concern is, right, is you were doing housing because it is impossible for my kid to drive there every day, right? We live way south, okay? And that's not possible. But if the school goes to virtual for any length of time, and I can see a month, shuts down for a month, doesn't make sense. But if we get into a heavy rate of pandemic and everything shuts down again, right? There's no sense in my kid sitting in a room there and paying for that room when he could do the same thing from anywhere in the country.
Right. And we had
and as long as you have some way to address that, I'm fine with that answer.
Yes, we do have a cancellation process available to students year round. There is specific qualifiers to be released from the contract. Now, if we found ourselves in a situation where we completely reverted, and I'll bring this up to our director too, because we are creating a COVID addendum language that's going to be coming out over the summer to basically address some of those specific nuances around addressing COVID, if it's even needed to the extent we're currently preparing for.
And we're all hoping it's not. right?
It is, yes. We're all
We're all hoping
we're
it's not-
preparing for more than what we hope we're going to get.
I much rather my son go to school in person.
Yes. Oh, yeah, definitely. And we're really excited to return to repopulation. We're stoked to see the students. I was on campus today. We have a housing dog program that we had started at the end of 2019 that we started to roll out in 2020. So we're really excited to be able to bring him back and have students be able to check him out again. And so there's a lot of excitement around repopulation for sure. I totally hear where you're coming from.
No, and it's just like the high schools are starting back up again. I can't keep them away from those campuses.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It's, it's funny because you don't always reflect on really, can't wait to go back to school, especially in high school or junior high, but it's a little bit different now. So thank you for that, Garrett. I appreciate it. And then next we have on Andromeda. So are we required to do COVID testing to live on campus? If so, will you provide the site on campus or would we have to go outside of campus? Great question. So currently this past year, we actually bring testing on site and it's only available to our residential students and our on-campus staff and faculty. We actually haven't even had it be available for commuter students going into this past year. And it's likely that that will continue, but even on a larger scale, allowing commuter students to test. We do plan on bringing in testing sites definitely throughout fall, and we're determining if it'll be needed in spring. But then now with the new announcement of the vaccination requirement, we're not anticipating needing as many testing sites and days as we were originally planning for, but we will have some. And then you'll get that communication not only to your MyCI email, but we'll also be posting it in the village offices and on our village screens. If there is ever a need where we would need you to route you to an office or a location off campus, we do have a lot of testing in Camarillo, Oxnard, and Ventura, lots of locations within the county. But currently we have not had to send any of our students to county testing sites. We've done them on campus for our students, even for a small population. So it's very likely that that will continue since our population would be larger, which would only warrant more need to have it siloed on our campus, if that makes sense. Thanks, Andromeda. All right, so Brant, so you talked about, so just to revisit the deadlines for housing, it is May 21st for any students returning that have lived on campus before and are returning housing students. And it is June 14th for any new incoming freshmen or transfer students. And then based on being vaccinated, students living on campus, how will shared spaces be monitored, such as cafeteria for meal plans? Great question. And Ariana, we are currently working on that. So we don't have an exact plan for what our dining facilities will look like. For our Islands Cafe that navigates our meal plans, we have two sides. So right now we're looking at operating out of only one side in the beginning, and then physically distancing out and closing certain tables to spread people out for eating. We're currently using the Islands Cafe patio as outdoor study space right now. So a lot of our dining, we have two large patio areas outside of our Islands Cafe. And so those will predominantly be the dining locations for students in the beginning with some minimal seating inside. And then as we continue to kind of see how this progresses with our surge of population back on campus again, then we'll continue expanding out to our normal facility capacity, which would eventually be both sides, but it really also depends on making sure we meet that 1,300 or so of occupancy, because if we only have like 700 or 800, then we would reduce our housing meal accommodations and what that would look like. That way we're not spending basically more campus money to keep more facility open than needs to be for the students that are actually here. All right, so going on, so son is admitted freshman, he's at work. Okay, so if he has a buddy who also was admitted, can they request to be roommates? Yes. So in the housing application process, there's a whole roommate section. You can write up a spiel that you put as the way you search for roommates. You fill out a preference, and you really want to make sure the student fills out the preferences, because it really allows them to reflect on their cleanliness level, what activity levels they prefer, when do they study, when do they sleep, any kind of smoking habits, It allows you to address to even like how you prefer to study. Some people really don't like to study in their room or be in a room where the room turns into a study area. They prefer it to be more of a living space. So we even try to nuance out those preferences among students. And then all of your preferences go into an algorithm matching portal. And we tend to operate at about a like 80% matching threshold or higher when we match our students. We try not to have it too low because then there's more of a likely chance for possible conflict because preferences are different. And so that's something we do factor in. And then of course you can always just, if you know their first and last name or their dolphin email. So it's first, last name, and then their 3 numbers. They would just give that email to you. And then when you're going in to request your roommates, you would put in their dolphin email, and then it would automatically put it in the system that you want to room together. Same thing as I mentioned earlier too, if your roommate is more of a preference than your building location, you'll want to mark that preference on the application. And there's a whole section for that, just because that allows us for you to tell us what's more important. Where do you want to live and like what building, or who you live with. So then if we do get to a situation where we can't give you both, it allows us to know which one would you pick if we can't give you both. Okay, so Andromeda, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. How many units do we need in person to live on campus? So to live on campus, there's no unit requirement. The units that we do have in a sense of requirement separate where you would live. So if you're an incoming freshman, you would be residing in Santa Rosa Village. If you're not an incoming freshman, or if we do have some sophomores that are coming in that actually want to reside in Santa Rosa because they weren't able to have, in a sense, that more traditional housing experience their freshman year. So we would be accommodating some of those requests. But if we have a student that's coming in that's a returning student of some kind or transferring in their sophomore year, they're likely to reside in Santa Cruz. For our incoming transfer students or our junior students, they tend to reside in Anacapa. And then our senior students tend to also be in Anacapa with a very small population up in our University Glen Town Center, which is a different kind of apartment style in the village options. And it's a little bit more removed from the campus. And we have about 100 students that live up there of the 1,300. So it's a much smaller population. So in terms of units, you don't necessarily need any to already have been completed to live on campus. However, you do need to be enrolled in at least 9 units to reside in housing, unless you have a specific exception that would qualify towards your specific case, in which we have worked with those before, and you would just work with the housing office to process that exception. So Maggie had wrote out that her friend had called the housing office and asked about having roommates in Anacapa Village. And they told her that we're only having singles in each room. So yes, that is correct. But this is actually how Anacapa tends to function, is mostly with singles, but your roommate is in a sense more your apartment mate, where there's 4 people, there's 4 individual bedrooms, and then each set of 2 bedrooms is in a wing of the apartment, and each wing has 1 bathroom. So the person that lives in bedroom A and bedroom B, they each have their own bedroom, but they share the bathroom. And so a lot of times we tend to say like, that's our roommate. When I lived in Anacapa, I'm an alum of Channel Islands. I would say the same thing. I'd call them my roommates, but technically we didn't sleep in the same room. We all had our own rooms. So that is how Anacapa is structured. When you go in and request roommates on your application, you can submit up to 3 other people, and you can, in a sense, select who you want in your apartment. Or you can go in random and utilize the profile option, which you're already going to be filling out, just in case your roommate preferences don't go through in any way. Sometimes we have issues where they're not mutual, in which you'll want to make sure you have clear conversations with the people that you're requesting, or sometimes people don't meet their payment deadlines and then they opt out at the last minute. A lot of things could happen. So you're still going to fill out your profile as part of the housing application to make sure that if we did need to pair you up through the system process, we could go ahead and do that. But it would be single. we wouldn't put 2 people in an Anacapa room for this next year. And it's actually not as common in future years. We had used it in one year where we were at maximum capacity before Santa Rosa was built. And then we used it as a possible option to be more cost effective for families. But going into this next year, it will be single for those rooms.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then Kaylina or Kaylena, sorry, I'm not sure if we are supposed to, oh, so you're good. You can submit them in the chat, or you could raise your hand, I'll call on you and you could write it out. But I'm reading through, so your friend and I want to be roommates and you're hoping to get into town center. Which room would work for us? I know that a lot of the rooms are 3 to 4 people. So what would work best for 2? And if we don't get into town center, how would that work with Anacapa? So great question. So with this one, there's a couple different options. So if you are opting to try to get into town center, you would probably most likely want to, I believe in our 1-bedroom accommodation, and let me just check to see what we have in our license agreement. So we do have a double occupancy in a studio apartment available for town center, which would mean that your kitchen and beds and living area are all in one room. We do also have double occupancy in a 1-bedroom apartment, which means your bedroom has a door and it's separate from your living room and kitchen and bathroom area. So double occupancy in a 1-bedroom apartment would also be another option if you want to share the same bedroom. And that would be your 2 options if you don't want anyone else in your space with your requested roommate. Now, if you didn't mind 2 other people in your space, similar to what the style would be in Anacapa, you could request to be either in a small double or a large double in a 2-bedroom apartment, in which you and your requested roommate would be in one room together, and then someone else and either their requested roommate or someone they were paired with would be in the other apartment. But they would factor in your preference scores from what you had put in to who they assign in the other bedroom. The same thing goes for Anacapa. When you request someone, they would place them on your side. So if you request one individual, then you would either be on the AB side or the CD side. And then whoever is on the whatever opposite side you're assigned in, they would use your profile question and answers to pair someone similar in their preference responses to yours. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, of course. All righty. So then Anelli, are there roommates in Santa Cruz or is it like Anacapa housing? So yes, in Santa Cruz, we do provide double occupancy. We actually have single, double, and triple as a possibility. We aren't going to have very many triples. This is more of for a cost-effective option for students. But when we say double, triple occupancy, when we use those phrases, that's how many bodies are in that room. So for while it is a list of double occupancy on Anacapa, it's unlikely we'll see much of those. And I can definitely find out for our 3rd Q&A session if anyone would like to pop back to see if there are updated information, because I know there's going to be more updates as we get closer to May 21st. I can definitely follow up on that in terms of how many doubles would we provide in Anacapa. But for Santa Cruz, yes, we'll have lots of doubles. We'll have doubles in a 1-room suite, doubles in a 2-room suite. The difference between that is you have 2 people sharing a bathroom in a vanity area versus 4 people sharing a bathroom in a vanity area. But in a place where you have 2 bedrooms in Santa Cruz, you would have a double vanity sink. You have a larger bathroom. So those kinds of things are balanced out to make sure you all have enough space. And then just following up, so our priority deadline for returning students is May 21st. If you've never lived on campus before, then you'd be considered as a new student entering in, and that deadline is June 14th. And then in terms of likeliness regarding town center, that one's a little bit tricky to fully answer because it very much is first come, first serve based on who submits the priority deadline. So naturally, our town center spaces do tend to be taken up first by our returning students since their priority deadline is earlier. Now that doesn't mean that we haven't had incoming transfers or new students that have never lived on campus be placed in town center. It really depends on making sure you meet your priority deadlines, the sooner the better, and then making sure you pay all of your payment deadlines on time, because that is something we have had where a student will meet the priority deadline, but if they miss a payment doing the housing installment payment plan, or if they're going to pay in full but they pay late, that could affect your housing assignment. So it's important that there's both on-time application and on-time payments. Thank you. Oscar, go right ahead.
Just a second. What's the dorms would be for the third years?
That one is most likely Anacapa. Anacapa houses predominantly our junior and senior students, and then they also have our transfer community. So any incoming transfers that want to opt into our transfer community are all assigned to the same floor. And then they have an RA that does things that are more focused on transfers. So that's one option. And then we do also have, for that community, there are also designated consumption zones, which are not necessarily present in all the other communities. We'll have some in town center and some in Anacapa. And depending on what our occupancy looks like, it's possible that there might be some in Santa Cruz, pending how occupancy goes. But those are basically if we have all students that are 21 and over and they complete a alcohol EDU course and they complete a designated consumption zone course, then they're provided a placard and a card that provide alcohol consumption privileges on campus. And there's a lot more detail in our resident handbook. We have our current years posted under our resources and forms if you wanted to look through that a little bit more, and I can paste a link to that for you. I'll paste our resources and forms because this is a really good location in our website to just reference our license agreement. It also is where you can submit a work order, talks about replacing a key, but under your licensee information on this page is our resident handbook, and I'll link this for you all. But this is basically the rules in housing, and then right before occupancy each year, we post the most updated version. So this is the one that's effective now. There's going to be a lot of differences in there because it's heavily responding to the current environment of the pandemic, but you'll be able to see some of our guidelines that we have for student housing.
Okay.
Other questions, Ariana?
Hi, I earlier you referenced kind of what the guest policy will kind of look like. I'm sorry, can you go over that one more time, please? As to what you guys have planned for right now and what it'll kind of look like.
I will say it's not fully planned out because it's going to go into the resident handbook that goes into effect for the next academic year. Currently, we know that we're not permitted guests. I have been talking with our directors. It's likely we're anticipating that it won't be as strict going into next year, but we are not sure what that is. So I can't really speak too much to the specifics since it hasn't been established yet. Hopefully I'll have more information as we get closer to our priority deadlines so we can give that information out to students. But unfortunately, a lot of it is a wait and see to see how the numbers of both Ventura County and the state are affected as vaccines continue to be administered. But with that said, I would say we're looking at the way it would go in terms of where we start is allowing guests of other students, like you could have other students come into your room. Then the next tier would be you're allowed to have someone who's not a student, that is someone you check in, they are required to be vaccinated or have an exemption. Or then the final level, if we were to go back to how we previously operated, was there were no requirements. You would just fill out a form, check in your guest online, and then if you needed a parking permit, you would physically come into the office to get that parking permit extension. But if you didn't need a parking permit, it's all just done online through your housing portal. So those are the different variations that we might be going towards. But I think it's important for you all as you're processing whether this is the decision you want to make. for living on campus is we know that in fall, there's going to be some more restrictions than we're anticipating for spring, but nowhere near the level of restrictions and precautions that we're experiencing during this academic year, if that makes sense. Other questions about living on campus, dates, deadlines, housing links, living, learning, and themed communities? Anything I can answer for you. We have about 15 minutes left. Please also feel if you're like, I've had all the information I need, I don't need to stay, you don't have to. This is very much an informal session.
Okay.
Just to get
thank you on the information.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Thank you for the information.
Oh yeah, thanks for being here. I really appreciate just everyone bringing their questions. I know that this is kind of a ongoing, you know, situation that we're all in, and I hope you all are taking care of yourselves and hanging in there, because whether you're a continuing student or a new student, it's a lot with what just everyone's experiencing, all these different experiences, having to adapt, having to, I know a lot of people say the term of the year is pivot, and you know, or hey, you're on mute. I don't know if any of you resonate with that one, but it's just kind of funny to see how we've had to kind of adapt with this. So I appreciate all of your patience as you've just been hanging in there, waiting to see how these institutions respond. So thank you for that.
All right.
And then Brant, so the $50 is the application fee and the deposit is $500. So that's actually a change that we had instituted last year. Our previous deposit used to be $1,500, and then during COVID, we adjusted it to $500, and we are still maintaining the deposit at $500. And so the deposit is due, I'm just checking to see if we have it in our license agreement so I can reference the exact, I'm just trying to operating off a couple different screens. So it depends on if you qualify for a deferral or not. If you do qualify for a deferral, which means you've met all the deadlines for your FAFSA and you submitted all your documentation in time and your expected family contribution is $4,000 or less, you qualify for a deferral, which means you wouldn't have to pay that housing deposit until your payment deadline of August 17th. Now, if you opt in for the housing installment payment plan, you would need to make your payment by that first date as well as the subsequent payments for then the September, October, and November deadlines. I'm trying to find where we have it for referencing when that first, I believe it would be August 17th. But I'm just double checking because I want to make sure if the deposit is due at your priority deadline, that's a possibility too. So let me actually, if you don't mind just sitting tight. Oh, yes, you're right. That's good to know for the virtual tour because that might be outdated information since it was just changed. But yes, it is 500 is the deposit for this academic year. And then let me just ask about I'm just going to message our director to see if we can get a response in this. Otherwise, what I could do is take down your information and send you an email for clarity. So we'll see if that response comes in or not. But yes, $500 deposit. And then the $50 is the application fee that you pay right at the start of the application. It's like the second or third step that it takes you to, because then once you pay that application fee, then it routes you into the rest of the application. And I believe if you're not deferred, that is usually due at the end of the application. Okay, yes. So your $500 deposit, if you do not qualify for your deposit to be deferred, it's due when you apply for housing. So when you get to that final step, it would be due. So for example, if you're a returning student and your priority deadline is May 21st, and that's when you're gonna officially submit your application. And then for a new incoming student, so incoming freshman, transfer, someone that's never lived on campus before, it would be June 14th. So then that is when, if you're waiting to apply, that's when that deposit would be due. Now, if you want to submit it earlier to get it out of the way, in order to submit would require the deposit at that last step. unless you qualify for a deferment, in which it's deferred till that August 17th date when all fees are due. Or you opted for the housing installment payment plan, which then your deposit and then whatever that first amount would be on August 17th. And then just to add on additionally too, once the deposit's received, this means that the student, it serves as their student priority date. So again, June 14th for our new students, and then returning students, May 21st. Perfect. And then Brant, did you also want this information emailed, or since we were able to get it, does that work for you?
Thanks, Tanya, so much. No, it works for me. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
of
you.
course. Good. Go ahead, Ariana.
I remember when I lived on housing, we would have, well, the RA would host like sometimes social events for the students to attend. Kind of what's going on now with the social distancing and everything like that. Would those events still be possible? Will they still be reoccurring within the housing community, or will they be held virtual like they are now?
Yeah, great question. So we do know we'll be continuing virtual events, but they won't be the predominant event type of event on campus. So we are expecting to have physical events. We're starting with our outdoor study space program. And then we're slowly progressing to some other different kinds of both training as well as events that we have for Welcome Week. There will be in-person events, but they'll naturally start the year to be a little bit more distant than typical, and then progress to reducing those restrictions. Right now, we were operating off of the last guideline within 3 feet. So we were adjusting certain things within our response and policies around the 3 feet. But it is possible from what we're hearing that there might not be any kind of distant requirement, especially if we are requiring vaccinations. So that would mean a lot more in-person events, but we are anticipating a hybrid model. So both that you'll see. And then there may be more RA meetings that might be virtual rather than in person, and then reserving more of the informal, you come when you want to at the event. Those might be more in person, if that makes sense. Because then the virtual part, if we're pulling everyone in at the same time for a meeting, like a floor meeting, it might be that those are navigated virtually in fall. Similar to like our town hall. If any of you have lived on campus before, you may recall at the beginning of every year, we'd all go into the gym, depending on which buildings you lived in, and we'd have a big presentation. You'd meet all the RAs. We usually had a fun little video that the RAs put together for the residents to introduce themselves. That is something we did completely virtually last year and will likely be virtual this year. But we are also looking at our check-in process. We did implement a lot more touchless options for check-in, and we're likely going to be continuing that to have some kind of drive-in check-in process. But then our PPE requirement might not be as high for our personal protective equipment requirement. Great question. And if you haven't checked out the islands, I can definitely link that for you all, because that's another great resource for students, or the island for at least our virtual events. In terms of our restaurants and bookstore and C-store in the market, we are still not sure. They haven't fully established what the expectations will be for which stores are open. We do have our Dolphin Pantry, which will still be operating throughout the academic year. So those will still have pickup days that are established for bags of groceries, and then we'll also have services for students that operate round the clock, that they're open. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But in terms of the restaurants, we currently have Tortillas open, and Mom Wong Kitchen has been open, but Pizza Pie and the market have not. Now, with our occupancy going up, I do anticipate that to change. I just don't know if it would mean that they would all open up. And it's likely that some of the locations that might be slower to open are places like the C-store. And then in terms of a mask mandate outside on campus, as of right now, we do require face coverings to be on campus. We're not sure if that's going to still be required, though, if everyone needs to be vaccinated. We haven't gotten that guidance from Ventura County Public Health. And I know that's one that I imagine many of your communities are still struggling with on, do we need to still require it when we go to the grocery store? Do we need to still require it when, you know, we go to the movies? So that unfortunately hasn't fully been decided. We are anticipating, though, yes, we'll prepare that we need face coverings.
So, but it's everywhere, indoors or outdoors on campus right now.
As of right now, yes. Yeah.
Okay, that was the question.
Oh, yes.
Most places it's indoors only.
Yeah. Like even for our campus, it's indoor, outdoor. And then we do tend, one thing to note as well is because we are a state institution, sometimes we have slightly more strict requirements than you'll see within the local county. And that's just based on the university is able to have a slightly different standard than the county based on how our population and structure is. So we like to let people know, just in case, say there's a no mask requirement in the community, but we might have one on campus because of the population surges, where you won't necessarily experience that if you go out into the community versus our 7,000 students that we would have back on campus. Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you all again so much for bringing your questions. These are really great and they really help us to be able to structure our responses and the information we put out on social media. So in terms of fall, for stores and restaurants, we are hoping that more are open than there are now, which would naturally make sense if we're having a lot more students. So for example, right now we're operating our dining out of Freudian Sip in the library, but that's because we only have about 170 students on campus. Whereas when we go up to 1,100 to 1,300 students, which is what we're anticipating, we'll definitely need a higher functionality, which is why we're looking at opening up one side of the dining hall versus the whole thing, because we may not necessarily need to open the whole facility yet. With the places like C-Store, Lighthouse Cafe, there of course is going to definitely be some kind of dining or restaurant or store available for students to address our commuter student population, but we're not sure which those are going to be because each area is managed by different kind of overarching areas. And that all the food runs through a specific association with the campus, and they haven't quite established what their guide is going to be for the next academic year. Once we have that information, though, we'll incorporate it into our Q&As. Any other final questions from everyone? Awesome. Thank you so much again for being here. I'm going to go ahead and put our student housing email. So if you do have any questions or anything that's specific to your account, feel free to email student.housing@csuci.edu. You can also, if you go to our housing webpage, we have a lot of our different social media accounts. If you like to communicate via social media, we do also respond to those messages through Facebook or Instagram, or if you'd like to tweet a question, we can always respond to you that way as well. Just more avenues for communication. And then we do have a new feature that rolled out within the last year, where if you go to our website, there's actually a chat box that will come up. And during the business day, it's likely to get more of immediate responses. If it's after hours, it's queued and then sent to someone who will reach back out to you once the office opens. So that's another form of chat, just to be able to get all your questions answered. We know this is an ongoing and evolving fluid environment. And so again, thank you all so much for being here, bringing your questions, remaining engaged with this kind of atmosphere. I know it's a little funky. It'd be great if we were all in a room talking together, but I appreciate you all hanging in there in this virtual environment. And if there is any support that you all need, please, please, please let us know. We are here to serve you. We are so excited to have students really moving back in larger larger groups for this this upcoming year. So thank you. And we hope that, you know, however, this is ultimately your decision to figure out where your home is. So if there's anything that we can do to kind of help you make that decision to determine where it best fits for you in your life, please let us know. We know that it's not for everybody, and we want to make sure that it's really going to fit with what you're looking for to expand and really enhance your college experience, because there's a lot of benefits, but there's also, it's not always easy moving away from home and everything. So thank you all so much. Again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Have an amazing day. Thank you all again. It's awesome seeing you here. And we will have another session later on if you come back with other questions. So you can always route to where you signed up, and we'll continue posting more as we go into summer.